Okay, something that's really fundamental to Plato is he is developing philosophy and the goals of philosophy and the goals of this approach to thinking. And we're seeing a really early version of this. And so what's fascinating to me in Eunice's reading is the kind of the separation of, and he's trying to do it really carefully because we see this in the Enlightenment. So I mentioned this briefly in one of the videos under the Sophists. When we got to the Enlightenment, okay, so Greek rhetoric, we're debating what is rhetoric, what is rhetorical theory, how do we use it, what is the goal of persuasion, is it for good or for evil? Now we're getting into Plato, right? And then we see in the Middle Ages, the church co-opts the idea of logos. So Aristotle's contribution, I know we're not there yet, but Aristotle's contribution, ethos, pathos, logos, kairos. Logos is supposed to be logical appeals, and the way we think about and think through and put together in a particular oration logical appeals to our particular audience. Because remember, invention, not critique. And the church changes the definition of logos from logic to the word of God. And so then that changes who has access to logic, who has the final say, what is an appropriate appeal when we're putting all these ideas together. Coming out of the Middle Ages, especially through the Enlightenment, we see science say, well, you know, if this is what we're doing, then logic needs to be separated. And they literally separate within rhetoric logic out. And so then rhetoric becomes just style. Like some people define it as mere style and mere stylistics because the content has to be separate. We're kind of seeing the foundations for that here with Eunice when he's talking about, and this is really in section 4.1, expertise. So if I am an expert on rhetoric, you know, and this is Plato's critique in the Gorgias, can a rhetorician who is an expert in rhetoric be an expert on any other content because their content is rhetoric? And that's how he's then building the foundation of very philosophical. I mean, he like the foundations of philosophy are all here. What can you be experts in and what can't you, and where does expertise really extend or not? And that's what Plato's debating. That's the idea he's developing. To an extent, he's debating this with himself, right? And writing these philosophies. And we see it start to come out. And so I do want to point out, like in 7.1, techne is focused on, but so is the idea of expertise, because we're seeing this tension between form and content. So the what and the how. Combined with that, or really honestly complicating that further, these texts are not designed to be critiques. Like, are they critiquing ideas? Yes, but the critique is not serving the function of an analysis. The critique is serving the function of education. And these are two different things, right? Like let's take this down to a K-12 level. We teach thinking through writing and we teach thinking through reading because the goal is the kinds of thinking and then like the transfer and the expansion of those skills into everyday life to serve the educated citizenry. Like that whole trajectory, even though Plato says that he wants a philosopher king, education still has a really important role in philosophical education. I almost said explanation, so sorry. Plato's philosophical education serves the foundation. These people who are heading towards being philosopher kings, plural, you know, who are serving some version of democracy still need an education. And the only way to ensure that we have just, like what we would call today, just and equitable serving leaders is philosophical education. And so he's trying to figure out through a lot of this, especially with the idea of techne and rhetoric as an art or rhetoric as something else, where do we get to be expertise? And if we are experts, and he's saying basically you can be an expert in one thing and one thing only, therefore a rhetorician can be an expert in rhetoric, but then their subject, their content can't be anything but rhetoric or they've lost the expertise. And that's where then philosophy becomes the overarching, and that's why for him, Socrates can talk about these varying topics, and I mean, just the sheer expansion of topics that are taken up by the texts that are covered in just this one chapter is immense. But that doesn't change the expertise, because he's a philosophy expert and he's dealing with dialectic, and the goal of dialectic, of uncovering these big T truths to head towards justness, so you can be a good and just leader, a good and just human, separate from the humans who are not. And he's really trying to make that separation, really say that, yeah, we can end up with unjust and evil leaders if they don't go through education this way. But he's really struggling with, okay, so then what is the content and what is the form, like the stylistics? But he's absolutely not saying that rhetoric is only style, because he's going into dialectic, but then rhetoric and persuasion serve the dialectic. And so then they are a part of the dialectic, or at least he doesn't follow that argument through enough to separate dialectic and rhetoric as only style. They end up getting lumped together towards the end, lumped together for what Eunice is saying is his view or his discussion or his definition of rhetoric that's kind of overlooked. But that's really complicated to follow. It's really, really complicated to follow, and it's not typically the way that we understand Plato, although it is becoming the way that rhetoricians are starting to talk about Plato. And so I just want to point out a lot of the complication in this early section is because Plato is dealing with what is content and what is form. How do I know how to say the thing that I want to talk about? And how are they always interconnected and overlapped? And how are they always separate? And I will say this comes up over and over and over again in contemporary conversations about composition, because one of the struggles of first year composition is we're really, like, if you look at most of the learning outcomes, we're talking about form. Writing process is kind of the only content that we teach in a first year writing class. We insert like what I would call artificial content to give us a subject to discuss, to try out. Like, we are a Plato text in that class where we're trying out these arguments and these persuasions. We're taking these intellectual risks with these ideas, and we're noticing the intellectual risks of others, because that serves the learning of the form, but it's not, none of the content is content that we are necessarily expertise in. I am a rhetorician and I am an expert in rhetoric. And so form, where does content come in and where doesn't it? And so I think a lot of the tension, or a lot of the complication here, and so this is a very dense chapter on Plato, a lot of those tensions are coming from, if we have these skills, you know, what we would today call skills, in the public, I think a lot of them are soft skills. I prefer the term core skills. There's this amazing book by, the authors are Grobman and, now I can't think of the other one. I can come up with, if you're interested in the book, let me know and I will get you the citation for it. But they call them core skills. So writing is a core skill, oral communication, a core skill, information literacy, media literacy, core skills, global information literacy, core skills. These are not soft skills. These are absolutely critical skills to everyday citizenship, but totally different topic. But it is really connected to what Plato's dealing with when he's like, Techne has expertise, and the sophists and Gorgias cannot be experts in anything except rhetoric. And then he goes on to use the thing that he was using as an educational example early to reinforce his version of and his view of rhetoric. And that's what Eunice is getting at by the end of the article. So I know that this is, I'm talking in the first because he's really setting the foundation for how complicated Plato's theory is, and how, you know, to an extent, Plato's just not quite there yet, and that's okay. Because it's a really interesting idea, and it's something we're still dealing with today. We deal with it in education on a daily basis. I know not all of you in this class are current educators or even want to be educators, and that is 100% fine, because this exists in real life too. What are the skills? And then what are the skills being used to do, applied to do. So if writing is a core skill in education, there are a lot of different ways that we can practice writing. You know, and we would argue you should practice writing in science, you should practice writing in history, because the more practice with various content, the more developed your critical thinking skills get. And so it's this, you know, round circle. Same applies in everyday life. If you are tasked with being a writer or needing to write something, the more you practice writing in that workplace with the language that is specific to that workplace, the better you get and the more efficient and effective you get at writing. Again, very, very, very circular. The more you practice the skill with the content, the better you are with the skill in the content. And then honestly, the more transferable it is to other content. So if you go from job A to job D, you immediately start from a higher level because you practice so much over here in job A. And that's the whole point. So Plato doesn't know how to deal with all of that yet, but Plato is the foundation of that complicated way that our brains work. And that complicated way that our brains work, I tell my first year students a lot of times that to an extent, I study the brain, because anybody who studies writing and literature studies the brain. Plato, philosophy, studying the brain and trying to understand form and content, and then how they overlap and where he thinks it's okay for them to overlap so that he can make the claim on philosophy as the pathway towards goodness, and goodness as the requirement for leadership. That's the direction he's headed, and it starts here really early on by separating those two things out, initially critiquing rhetoric as just form, and then as the content. That means that, you know, you have this very, very narrow thing that you can talk about, and then he goes on to demonstrate rhetoric by doing the exact same thing that he was saying the sophists were bad for doing, but he's doing it to serve goodness and to develop good and just leaders, and so it's philosophy, not rhetoric.